Welcome for another lesson in this course, and it's a pretty different lesson because in the beginning of this course I told you that I'm very rational. I like a more academic approach where you use conceptual frameworks and so on, but this lesson is actually going to do the complete opposite. We will go into the complete irrational because sex is actually very irrational. Now, what I'm going to say in this lesson is of a completely different nature. There are no experiments. It's not based on any academic research, but it's more based on some research through literature, what ancient wisdom says, but also some personal experiences that I've had. Now we will be looking at masculinity and femininity, which is about some kind of gendered energetic qualities. Now, if we look at the 9 types, the 9 enneatypes, they're really archetypes, and you cannot really understand them purely intellectually. If you really want to grasp what these archetypes are about, you need to somehow feel them with your body. You need to sense it. You also need to feel it somehow emotionally. Now, each of these 9 types has lots of qualities. And we're using lots of adjectives, and quite often these adjectives have some kind of gendered qualities, some kind of gendered energy. So we will be looking in this in this class or in this lesson. But before we do that, what is masculinity and femininity? We'll have to look a little bit at ancient wisdom because it's very hard to describe them, and especially in contemporary society, where questions of gender identity, sexual orientation, it's all very contentious. And when we're talking about masculinity and femininity, quite often people start thinking about social roles. So this is not what it is about. Still, I believe that this lesson can be contentious for our contemporary society. So I want to make it clear that what I'm going to say in lesson 3 is mainly my vision, my view. I cannot prove anything, so if you want to disagree with me completely, feel free and just skip this part. Now, if we go back to ancient wisdom, what is feminine energy? It's very much about the intuitive mind and about matriarchal values. It's all about feeling, nourishing, empathy, vulnerability, compassion, creativity, flexibility, collaboration, inclusiveness, and so on. And actually, if we look at it, there's some kind of relation to the female genitals. Basically, in order for the sexual function to work properly, the vagina has to be soft, receptive, and relaxed. On the other side, we have the masculine energy, which is very much about the objective and the rational mind, and linked to patriarchal values like doing, achieving, planning and implementing, setting goals and priorities, fighting, competing, rules, structure, organization, pragmatism, domination, power, and so on. And also here, if we are looking at the penis, it needs to be strong, rigid, forceful, energetic, dedicated, determined in order to do what it has to do. So basically, these masculine and feminine energetic qualities are somehow opposites. But it doesn't mean that one is more important than the other. Actually, they are both equally important, because in order to get to harmony and prosperity, we need to balance them out, and actually one cannot exist without the other. This is what we see in this yin-yang symbol that all of you know. Now, if we are looking at the enneatypes, we can also use many adjectives that have some kind of masculine or feminine traits. So for example, if we look at type 1, there's lots of masculine energy when we look at the adjectives that we use, right? For example, type 1 is often principled, purposeful, self-controlled, conscientious, well-organized, orderly, critical, and impatient. If we look at another type, type 2, for example, there we'll see that lots of these adjectives have some kind of feminine energetic qualities. So when we look at the adjectives like caring, people-pleasing, empathetic, warm-hearted, friendly, sentimental, flattering, unselfish, altruistic. And you may also have noticed that quite often when we are talking about types 2 and 4 that we often refer to her, or when we speak about types 1 or 8 that quite often somehow subconsciously we speak about him. Now this basically shows that somehow subconsciously many of us associate these ego structures of the types with masculine or feminine energetic qualities. And a few people have actually looked at that already and they have written about that. For example, Judith Searle, she wrote an article in the journal The Enneagram Monthly about 25 years ago. And there, for example, she said that 8 women are unwomanly and male 4s are rather unmanly. And she also came up with quite some gender characteristics of all of these types. Some people have looked at that before, and already 25 years ago, Judith Searle wrote an article for the Enneagram Monthly in which she basically looked at these masculine and feminine traits of the different types, and she saw that 8s are pretty masculine and 4s have more of these feminine traits. Also 15 years ago, somebody else, Susan Rhodes, also wrote an article for the Enneagram Monthly, and there she said that the gut types tend to be masculine, heart types have more feminine energy, and the head types have more an androgynous energy. So she looked at it from a completely different angle. And then actually another one, a very interesting book which was written a few years ago by the late David Daniels and Suzanne Dion. It's the Enneagram in Relationships and Intimacy, and there they have an entire chapter completely dedicated to gender and these masculine and feminine energy of the different types. And basically in their view, 3 types are gender male. These are types 8, 3 and 5. Then they say types 1 and 7 are gender neutral, but they lean towards a masculine. Then you have type 6, which is somehow in the middle. It's really androgynous. It's gender neutral. Type 9 has gender qualities that are also gender neutral, but they slightly tends towards the feminine. And then they say that types 2 and 4 are gender female. Now, these are all different perspectives, but I also have my own perspective. Basically, a few years ago, when I was thinking about this whole issue about masculinity and femininity of the types, and I was in a deep meditative state, suddenly a geometric pattern appeared. And this is what I'm going to describe now. So what I'm going to say in the next half hour or so is not based on research, it's just some kind of knowledge that came to me. So, what am I going to describe and what am I not going to describe? Because it's very important, especially as the whole topic about gender identity is so contentious. I will be talking about the types, about the points on the Enneagram. I'm not talking about people, but it's really about the caricatures of the 9 different enneatypes. People are a bit different. People have arrows, we have wings, we're constantly in motion, there's other parameters involved. The other thing is that we're only going to look at the type structure. We're not going to involve any of the instincts. We're not going to look at counter types, but purely what is the gendered energy of the point on the Enneagram symbol. It's also important to understand that we'll be talking about masculine and feminine energy. It's not about masculinity and femininity, it's not about social role, it's not about how one should be, it's not about expectations. It's also not about desirability, because, for example, in our society, male 3s and female 2s are like the most desirable masculine and feminine traits. But this is not universal, because, for example, in Korea, men should be like 8s, and women who correspond to type 9 are the most desirable. Actually, also in our own Western industrialized society about 100 years ago, actually women who had very 8ish characteristics were considered to be more female and more desired. So again, it's not about gendered roles, or it's not about social roles in our environment. Now, first I'm going to speak a little bit about the gendered energy of the type and how we see it. And then I'm also going to look a little bit at what is invisible, because by combining this visible and the invisible, we get to this yin-yang symbol, because both are needed. Let's start with type 8, because in this geometrical model, type 8 is the most masculine of all. It's the alpha male. It's like the dominant gorilla. Just the posture of the 8 can be already quite impressive and imposing, and it can even scare people. And 8s are constantly activated. So if we're looking at the adjectives that we use to describe type 8, there's a lot of this masculine energy in there. They're dominant, competitive, confrontational, and emotional. 8s are very much focused on action, power. They're very strong, robust, demanding, hard-hearted. They're blunt, they're bossy, and they're controlling. Now, this also explains why female 8s might quite often have a hard time in our society, because they don't fit the societal stereotypes or the expectations that we may have on women. Female 8s are quite often extremely independent. They are energetic, tough-minded and direct, and that is not always appreciated in our society. The second most masculine type is type 1. If we're looking at the adjectives that we are using to describe them, we can indeed see this masculine energy. For example, words like rigid, organized, structured, diligent, principled, organized, serious, punctual, mannerly, practical, diligent, deliberate. Claudio Naranjo even called them over-civilized and over-controlled. And then David Daniels and Suzanne Dion wrote in their book that ones tend to choose duty and work over pleasure and play, which can feel patriarchal and authoritative. They limit spontaneity, so they are quite cool, measured, calculated, and methodical. So clearly, type 1 corresponds very much to this description of masculine energy. Now, the third most masculine type is type 3. And I would actually call them the pseudo-alpha male, because 3s very much want to be like this very masculine type. And they are often seen like that because in our society they are seen as the most desirable. But if you compare them to type 8s, they're not as dominant, they're not as robust. 3s actually seek more approval and they're actually less direct. Still, if we are looking at the adjectives that are used to describe type 3, they're still pretty masculine energetically. Efficient, dynamic, rigid, productive, ambitious, linear, action-oriented, persuasive, and assertive. I mean, 3s really want to be like a hero and a winner, so it's a very masculine trait. And even if we look at the female 3s, because female 3s are extremely conscious of gender stereotypes, and they may want to adopt a very feminine image, but they do so in a very masculine way actually, because they do it in a very goal-oriented way. They do it in a very assertive, unemotional, efficient, and rather insensitive way. So let's now move to the other end of the spectrum. We saw the 3 most masculine types. Let's now look at the 3 most feminine types. And many people think that type 2 is the most feminine of all, and indeed in terms of our societal views and expectations, 2s may be the most feminine. But if we look at this feminine energetic qualities, then it's actually type 4 that is the most feminine. Let's have a look at the adjectives. Creative, aesthetic, imaginative, intuitive, sensitive, romantic, thoughtful, soft, gentle, self-sacrificing, expressive, delicate, tasteful, understanding, and so on. So, just like female aids may have some challenges to fit the societal models, the same also applies for male fours. They quite often have some challenges in complying with the social norms and expectations. So for example, male fours, they quite often feel bad about repressing their own feminine side. They also have problems with conforming to the standards of being a man in our society. Also, quite some men, and then we're talking especially in the sexual realm, prefer to feel like a goddess rather than a god. And also many males may actually feel very much in touch with their feminine side because they may like to grow long hair, they may touch their hair, they may speak softer, they may be more emotional in their speech and so on. Now, all of this doesn't mean that they have some kind of issues with gender identity, not at all. It just shows that they are more open and it's more easy for them to explore their feminine side because everybody has a feminine side. The second most feminine type is type 2. Also here, the adjectives are pretty clear. 2s are caring, pleasing, generous, loving, attentive, affectionate, sensitive, compassionate, tender, accommodating. Clearly very feminine. And also here actually quite often male 2s deviate a little bit from the societal standards of what it is to be a man. They don't really fit the stereotype. Male 2s are much more in touch with their emotions and they also tend to be a little bit more irrational. Now the third most feminine is type 9. 9s are non-obtrusive, attentive, able to see all viewpoints, balanced, gentle, agreeable, easygoing, receptive, compliant, dependable, helpful, supportive, cordial, gentle, kind, relationship-oriented, thoughtful, and so on. So all adjectives carrying a very feminine energy. So we've had the masculine types, we've had the feminine types, so what about the gender neutral ones or the androgynous ones? We still have types 5, 6 and 7. Let's start with type 5. Type 5 is gender neutral but tends slightly to the masculine. And if we're looking into the adjectives that are used to describe type 5, we don't see much of a gender energy. 5s are quiet, visionary, wise, analytical, private, humorless. Now, their analytical and rational approach and also the lack of receptivity they have may give the impression of being masculine. But at the same time, they can also be quite sensitive, creative, highly interested in the irrational and the esoteric, which are more tending towards the feminine. The other thing is that 5s are not really action-oriented like the masculine types. But on the other side, they're also not emotion-oriented like the feminine types. Type 6 is, I would say, the true androgynous type. It does not lean towards masculine, it doesn't lean towards the feminine. And it's probably the most interesting to discuss at all here. And I think it's also explaining lots of other dynamics that we can see in the Enneagram in general, specifically to type 6. Because type 6 is contrarian, it's full of internal contradictions. And we can really see this in the field of gendered energy, because 6s are actually both masculine and feminine, and from the other side they're actually neither masculine nor feminine. So they're actually very egalitarian, and it seems that they somehow want to reduce the differences and polarities that may exist. So 6s, they can actually tap into both energies at the same time with a certain ease, but they don't want to take it too far. So they can be masculine but not too masculine, and they can have feminine traits but they cannot be too feminine either. For psychologists, you could actually say that 6s have this permanent battle between their animus and their anima. Basically, 6s are constantly trying to balance out one against the other, and they end up neutralizing them. And this gives really this sense of some kind of impression of a lack of vital energy. And later on in this course, we'll also see how this neutralization of polarities and sexual energy actually has a very negative impact in their sexual play. But if we're looking at type 6, are they masculine or feminine? Well, 6s are both competitive and cooperative, and the interesting thing is they can be both at the same time. And 6s can be both assertive and easygoing, again, at the same time. 6s distrust the rational, but they equally distrust the irrational. 6s are logical and illogical at the same time. 6s can be both structured and chaotic, and somehow it coexists in them. They can be helpful and unsupportive at the same time. 6s can be accepting and judgmental. They can be cold and amiable. Basically, they can be both and none all at the same time. And this ambiguity about this gendered energy is something that can be felt in just anything in their life, because quite often 6s have an aversion to masculinity, they have an aversion to femininity, but at the same time they still care about it, because they often fear that they're not masculine or they're not feminine enough. So for example, male 6s want to be masculine, but they don't want to be seen as toxic masculine. And women want to be seen as feminine, but they don't want to be targeted for their femininity. And the other thing is that men love the femininity of women, but they can easily be overwhelmed by the irrationality of the feminine. And women may actually be attracted and love the strength and masculinity of men, but they can also fear being overpowered by this power and strength. Now, the last type is type 7, which is also androgynous, but slightly leans into the feminine, I would say. And if we're looking at the adjectives that we are using there to describe this type, also there we do not see any strong gendered energy. 7s are positive, spontaneous, imaginative, playful, inspirational, curious, relaxed, inventive, humorous, contented, assertive, and so on. So also here, 7s actually don't like the power of polarity. And women, for example, they may feel feminine and they may actually like to dress up and to use makeup, but it's not out of pure femininity, it's more their playfulness. And if we're looking at men, they may feel masculine, but it's not related to the assertivity that you're going to see in type 8. 7s also have an assertivity, but it's an entitlement assertivity, quite different. So before we go to this geometrical figure, I want to quickly go back to the difference between the stereotype, the caricature of the archetypes, and real people. Because as I said, real people have wings and arrows, and where these things are permanently in motion. So the gendered energetic qualities of a real human being are quite often a little bit different than what we're going to see in the caricatures. So for example, if we take type 5, when type 5 becomes very convinced and confident of their own knowledge and their own intellectual patterns, they can take on lots of these 8ish qualities and characteristics, which may give them a little bit of a more masculine feeling. Type 2, for example, if we're looking at the connecting lines, they are connecting with type 8 and type 4, so they are connecting, they're in permanent motion between the most masculine and the most feminine energies of these archetypes. And we can actually see this polarity, because 2s want to dominate by pleasing and accommodating, or they can be assertive by helping others. And this is actually why 2s can actually easily transform from a princess into a knight. And this is also why Naranjo actually wrote that 2s can be both tender and aggressive, and that their motto seems to be make love and war. So if we're looking, for example, also the mythological Cassandra, who is a typical 2, she really shows this archetypal conflict between the masculine and the feminine. If we are looking at hysteria, the emotional disorder which existed in the past with many women and was diagnosed very much in the 19th century, is basically a manifestation of this psychic split of this masculine versus feminine energies. So in women, this hysteria is very much about rejecting the female social role, and in men it's very much about rejecting the male social role. So I described these 9 types and the gendered energetic qualities, but is this random? Actually not. This geometric shape that I got in my meditative state shows a very clear sequence. Let's start with the most masculine. We start in point 8. And we jump over type 9 and we get to the second most masculine, which is type 1. We jump over type 2 and we get to the third most masculine, which is type 3. We jump over 4 and we get into type 5, which is already androgynous but leans a little bit into the masculine. We jump over 6 and we get into 7, which is androgynous but slightly feminine. We jump over 8, we get to 9, which is already into the feminine realm. We jump over the 1 into 2, which becomes a very feminine type. Jumping over 3, we arrive into 4, which is the most feminine type of all. And points 4 and 8 are connected by point 6, which is the most androgynous. Now, the interesting story doesn't end here, because what we see in types is not necessarily showing everything. It's like an iceberg, right? You just see a little bit, but there's so much below. And the same happens with the types of our ego. Basically, people who show themselves as being extremely robust on the outside are quite often pretty mellow inside, or people who show themselves as being very confident actually deep inside lack confidence. And the same happens with the Enneagram types. So for example, type 4, which is the most feminine in visible terms, they are very emotional from the outside. They're actually extremely robust on the inside. If we're looking into the invisible and what's really inside of this type, they're actually the most masculine, you could say, because they're the most robust. They're going to stand against every storm. They can be pretty emotional, but once they have taken a decision, they're not going to change their mind very easily. The same happens with types 2 and 9. They may look emotional from the outside, but deep inside, they're very strong. If we're looking on the other spectrum, type 8, for example, they have this armor, they're really showing this strength, but why? Because deep inside, they're probably the most emotional types of all. They're also not very steady, because type 8, when they have their opinion, they're really going to defend it. But it's very likely that the next day the type 8 is just going to change his or her opinion and again defend it with the same ardor, and they're going to say, no, what you say, no, yesterday I could not have said that, that's impossible. I have never said anything, I would not be even able of thinking of that. A good example is Donald Trump, right? Day 1 he says something, the next day he says completely the opposite, and both days he's extremely convinced of himself. The same we can see with types 1 and 3. Very masculine energy from the outside, but inside it's very feminine. And this brings us back to this yin and yang symbol, where both masculine and feminine have to be there and they balance each other out. So if you are as type 4 most feminine outside, you need to be the most masculine inside. Type 6, which is different from the outside, they're very androgynous. Also deep inside, they're equally androgynous. And if then we look at this order of this subconscious or the invisible, then we basically just see the reverse order of this geometrical pattern.